Today, I want to answer what are the disadvantages of a land contract. The more I talk about land contracts, the more I realize there's a lot of questions surrounding land contracts. And one of the biggest questions I get asked is what are the disadvantages of a land contract? By the end of this video, you're going to understand all of the disadvantages associated with a land contract, everything from financial implications, legal risk, and practical challenges that will come up. Did you realize that entering into a land contract, if you are a buyer and it's done the wrong way, could potentially lead to you losing the property and all the money you've paid up to that point? Stick around and I'll share with you why this could happen by first explaining exactly what a land contract is. Next, I'm going to go through the components that make up a land contract. And finally, the advantages and disadvantages of a land contract for both the buyer and the seller. If you're ready, let's go. So a land contract is a legal agreement for a seller financed purchase that does not utilize traditional financing and bank financing. Essentially, it's the seller and the buyer interacting together where the buyer makes periodic payments to the seller over a period of time. A land contract is sometimes called a bond for title or contract for deed. So let's talk about the components within a land contract. Number one is the sale price of the property. I think that's pretty standard, pretty well understood. The next thing is the interest rate. Now this is where it could get interesting because with a land contract, it's a seller financing and typically a buyer's coming into a property where they're buying it utilizing a land contract because their financial situation maybe isn't the best. So the seller usually charges a higher interest rate than traditional financing. Then there's the monthly periodic payment and how much is that amount every single month. Also, there could be baked into a land contract a balloon payment, which a balloon payment is just at a certain point down the road, the remaining balance of the loan is due. That balloon payment might be necessary after 5 years, 10 years, or whatever is decided between buyer and seller. And there's also a component called equitable title. And this is for the buyer and it prevents the seller from reselling the property or potentially taking out liens on the property. So it protects you as a buyer to have this equitable title. And the last two components that are pretty important, assurances made that there's no taxes or liens on the property. And finally, a requirement to record the land contract with the appropriate government agency or entity. So when is a land contract typically used? A land contract is typically going to be used with a buyer that has poor credit or they do not have the funds to utilize this down payment. Because with a land contract, a buyer can get into a property with no money down and even poor credit and actually be in a home that they own equitable title to. And there's a strategy in real estate called slow flipping that utilizes the land contract every time. And to understand that and fully understand land contracts and how they fit into these different strategies or how they make sense to a buyer and a seller, let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages to both the buyer and the seller. So let's jump in and talk about the buyer. So what are the pros for the buyer? Well, I talked about a few of those. Really, if you have poor credit, no money, it's an absolute pro for a buyer to be able to get into a property with no money down and bad credit and have equitable title to a home that you're living in and deal directly with the seller. And also the buyer gets to enjoy the property just like they would if they got a traditional loan with a bank. So what are the negatives if you are the buyer? Well, number one, you're not building up equity with your payments. And because you're dealing directly with the seller rather than the bank, you're probably not going to build up your credit because the seller isn't reporting those on-time payments to the credit industries where a bank would. Another challenge for the buyer is if there is a balloon payment in that land contract and by the end of the term where you need to pay off the balance of the loan with a balloon payment, if the buyer cannot make that payment or can't get traditional financing, you as a buyer lose that property and you lose all the money that you've paid up to that point and the seller retains the property. So understand a land contract absolutely favors the seller more so than the buyer. And it's not like something you can fight for. It's not like a traditional mortgage where they might give you notices and they go through foreclosure process. That's not the case with a land contract. The seller has the ability, which is talking about one of the advantages now for a seller, they have the ability to act as a landlord where they can evict you from the property if you default on that contract. They do not have to go through a foreclosure process. So that's also an advantage to the seller, even though it's a disadvantage to the buyer. A couple other advantages for the seller is they can charge more than traditional lending because they're not requiring a down payment. So they can charge a higher interest rate and potentially make more on the property. Also with a land contract, the seller doesn't need to pay off any underlying mortgages. A seller could do something called a wraparound mortgage where they use a land contract the money that comes in, and let's say it's higher than their normal mortgage, they take that money, they wrap around and pay their mortgage company and keep the difference. What are the disadvantages if there are any? Well, number one, you're taking a risk as a seller because you're becoming a bank to somebody who maybe isn't credit worthy or doesn't have the money. So that individual might be a higher risk of not making payments or doing some damage to the property. Another disadvantage, the seller doesn't get all of the money up front like a traditional purchase, which could be a disadvantage. Overall, when you're looking at disadvantages in a land contract, many times the biggest disadvantages fall on a buyer, whereas a seller, a land contract is absolutely advantageous. And I love land contracts. And I've utilized strategies with land contracts. However, I've utilized a strategy right now that I'm doing called cash flow flipping that is crushing it in today's market with little to no money out of your pocket. And if you want to learn this strategy step by step, I wrote a book called Cash Flow Flipping, and you can click on the link cashflowflipping.com and receive my book 100% free. No questions asked, no obligation. Thanks for stopping by. Have an amazing day.